June 18th, 1815. A muddy field in Belgium. Napoleon Bonaparte, the man who'd conquered most of Europe, faced the coalition that had sworn to destroy him. And one of them, either Napoleon or Wellington, would walk away as history's victor while the other's empire crumbled to dust. The question wasn't whether this would be bloody. Everyone knew it would be. The question was, could anyone actually defeat Napoleon? He'd crushed every army Europe threw at him. And now, one British general and his exhausted coalition stood between Napoleon and total victory. By sunset, 50,000 men would be dead or wounded. This is the story of Waterloo. Welcome to Britain's history. Today, we're diving into one of history's most decisive battles, a fight so close that Wellington himself called it the nearest run thing you ever saw in your life. Because Waterloo wasn't a crushing victory or an easy triumph. It was 12 hours of desperate fighting, where victory and defeat hung in balance, where every decision mattered, and where the outcome would determine the future of Europe and the world. But before we get to that muddy Belgian field, before we watch Napoleon launch his final desperate attacks against Wellington's line, we need to understand how these two titans ended up facing each other on June 18th, 1815. Because without knowing the road to Waterloo, you can't truly appreciate what happened when these armies finally collided. And if you're enjoying this deep dive into history, make sure you're subscribed. We've got dozens more battles lined up, each one as dramatic as Waterloo. Don't miss them. Let's go back to March 1815, when Napoleon Bonaparte escaped from exile on the island of Elba and returned to France. Napoleon had been Europe's master, the emperor who'd conquered from Spain to Russia, defeated every coalition sent against him, and redrawn the map of Europe according to his will. But in 1814, after the disastrous Russian campaign and defeats in Germany and France, the European powers had finally beaten him. They'd forced his abdication, exiled him to Elba, restored the Bourbon monarchy under Louis XVIII, and believed the Napoleonic era was finished. They were wrong. On March 1st, 1815, Napoleon landed in southern France with about 1,000 loyal soldiers. It seemed like madness. One man with a tiny force trying to reclaim an empire. But Napoleon understood something the European powers didn't. France was unhappy with the restored monarchy. The Bourbon had brought back the old nobility, threatened revolutionary land settlements, and seemed determined to turn back the clock to before 1789. Many Frenchmen, especially in the army, remained loyal to Napoleon. As Napoleon marched toward Paris, the government sent armies to stop him. They failed. Entire regiments switched sides when they saw Napoleon. Officers who'd sworn loyalty to the king wept and rejoined their emperor. Marshal Ney, who'd promised Louis XVIII to bring Napoleon back in an iron cage, took one look at his old commander and immediately pledged loyalty. By March 20th, without firing a shot, Napoleon entered Paris as Louis XVIII fled to Belgium. The emperor was back. Think about this for a moment. You're a French soldier. Your emperor, the man you followed for a decade, returns from exile. Your king tells you to arrest him. Napoleon walks towards you alone. What would you do? Fight for the king who fled, or follow the emperor who led you to glory? Thousands of soldiers faced this choice. Almost all chose Napoleon. Would you have? Drop your thoughts in the comments. Europe reacted with alarm and fury. The Congress of Vienna, where European powers were redrawing borders and settling the post-Napoleonic order, immediately declared Napoleon an outlaw. Britain, Austria, Prussia, and Russia formed the Seventh Coalition against him. Over 700,000 troops would eventually converge on France from all directions. Napoleon faced impossible odds. His army numbered perhaps 280,000, and he was surrounded by enemies. But Napoleon had advantages. His enemies' armies weren't yet concentrated. If he moved fast, he could defeat them piecemeal before they united against him. The nearest threats were two armies in Belgium. The Anglo-Allied army under the Duke of Wellington, about 95,000 British, Dutch, Belgian, and German troops, and the Prussian army under Field Marshal Blücher, about 120,000 men. If Napoleon could drive between them, defeat one, then turn and destroy the other, he might buy time for diplomatic solutions, or at least better negotiating terms. Wellington and Blücher were formidable opponents. Wellington had never lost a battle in his career, defeating French armies in Spain and Portugal during the Peninsular War. He was methodical, defensive-minded, and brilliant at choosing terrain that favored his tactics. Blücher, at 72 years old, was aggressive to the point of recklessness, but beloved by his troops, who called him Marshal Forward for his attacking spirit. The two commanders had agreed to support each other. If one was attacked, the other would march to help. This mutual support would prove decisive. On June the 15th, Napoleon crossed into Belgium with about 128,000 men, moving faster than Wellington or Blücher expected. His plan was to drive between the two Allied armies, defeat them separately, then march on Brussels. It was classic Napoleonic strategy: speed, surprise, interior position, defeat in detail. On June the 16th, Napoleon fought two battles simultaneously. At Quatre Bras, Marshal Ney engaged Wellington's advance forces in an indecisive fight. At Ligny, Napoleon personally commanded the attack on Blücher's Prussian army. Ligny was a French victory. The Prussians were driven from the field with heavy losses, and Blücher himself was nearly killed when his horse was shot and fell on him. For several hours, he was missing, presumed dead. But the old marshal survived, and critically, the Prussian army wasn't destroyed. They retreated north in relatively good order toward Wavre, staying in contact with Wellington's forces. Wellington, learning of the Prussian defeat, withdrew his army to a position he'd previously scouted, a low ridge near the village of Waterloo, about 9 miles south of Brussels. It was excellent defensive ground. The ridge concealed most of his army from French artillery observation. The approaches were muddy from recent rain. Several fortified farms, Hougoumont, La Haye Sainte, Papelotte, anchored his flanks and center. Wellington deployed his 68,000 men. Reinforcements had joined him along the ridge and waited for Napoleon. Blücher had promised to march to Wellington's support, but it would take time. Wellington had to hold until the Prussians arrived. Napoleon approached Wellington's position on the evening of June 17th, but decided not to attack immediately. The ground was soaked from thunderstorms. His artillery would bog down in mud. Better to wait for morning when the ground dried. It was a fateful decision. Every hour's delay gave the Prussians more time to reach the battlefield. Napoleon believed he'd separated Wellington and Blücher, and that the Prussians were retreating toward their supply lines, away from Waterloo. He was wrong. Blücher was marching toward Wellington, not away. The morning of June 18th dawned grey and damp. The armies faced each other across muddy fields. Napoleon commanded about 72,000 men and 246 guns. Wellington had 68,000 men and 156 guns deployed on the ridge. The French had numerical and artillery superiority, but Wellington's defensive position was strong, and somewhere to the east, the Prussians were coming. The question was, could Wellington hold long enough for Blücher to arrive? Napoleon's plan was straightforward. Massive artillery bombardment to shatter Wellington's line, then infantry and cavalry attacks to break through. Once the line broke, French cavalry would exploit the gap and turn the British flanks. It was the same formula that had won Napoleon dozens of victories. He was confident. "I tell you, Wellington is a bad general, the English are bad troops, and this will be a picnic," he reportedly told his marshals. They were less certain. Wellington had never lost. The British infantry were among the best in Europe, and the Prussians might arrive. The battle began around 11:30 a.m. with a diversionary attack on Hougoumont, the fortified farm on Wellington's right flank. Napoleon intended it as a feint to draw Wellington's reserves, but the attack escalated into a full-scale battle for the farm that lasted all day. British guards and German troops defended Hougoumont with desperate courage. The French threw regiment after regiment at the walls. Fighting raged in the courtyard, the chapel, the gardens. At one point, French soldiers broke through the main gate. British defenders, including a giant officer named MacDonald, physically closed the gate against the French, sealing them inside to be killed. Hougoumont never fell, tying down thousands of French troops who were desperately needed elsewhere. Around 1 p.m., Napoleon launched his main attack, a massive artillery bombardment followed by infantry assault on Wellington's left centre. 80 French guns opened fire, pounding the British lines. But Wellington had positioned most of his infantry on the reverse slope of the ridge, protected from direct artillery fire. The French bombardment was less effective than Napoleon hoped. When French infantry, d'Erlon's corps, about 16,000 men, advanced up the slope in massive columns, they met British infantry formed in lines. This was the classic tactical matchup: French columns versus British lines. The British infantry, deployed 2 ranks deep, could bring far more muskets to bear than French columns, where only the front ranks could fire. British volleys tore into the French columns at point-blank range. French officers fell. Men in the front ranks were obliterated. But the French kept coming, sheer mass and momentum carrying them forward. For a moment, it seemed they might break through. Then Wellington's heavy cavalry charged. The Household Brigade and Union Brigade, British heavy cavalry in their finest uniforms, thundered down the slope into the French columns. The impact was devastating. French infantry, already reeling from British volleys, broke under the cavalry charge. Thousands of French soldiers were killed, captured, or scattered. It was a brilliant British success. But the British cavalry didn't stop. Intoxicated by success, they charged on toward the French guns, becoming disorganized and exhausted. French lancers countercharged, catching the British cavalry scattered and blown. The British heavy cavalry was cut to pieces. The Union Brigade was virtually destroyed. Both British cavalry brigades had to withdraw, having suffered enormous casualties. They'd saved Wellington's line, but at terrible cost. Around 3:30 p.m., Marshal Ney launched a massive cavalry attack. Thousands of French horsemen charging Wellington's infantry squares. It was a catastrophic mistake. Infantry formed in squares, bristling with bayonets on all sides, were nearly invulnerable to cavalry if they held their nerve. And British infantry always held. French cavalry charged again and again, as many as 12 times over 2 hours. Wellington's squares held. French horses died in heaps. French cavalry were shot down or repelled. British artillery, positioned between the squares, fired canister shot into the French cavalry at point-blank range, killing hundreds. The charges failed completely. Here's a question historians still debate. Was Ney a hero or the man who lost Waterloo? He'd fought for Napoleon for 20 years, led cavalry charges at Borodino, commanded armies across Europe. But at Waterloo, he ordered thousands of cavalrymen into suicidal attacks against infantry squares, attacks any competent officer should have known would fail. Was he trying too hard to prove his loyalty after briefly serving the king? Was he just having a terrible day? Or was he following Napoleon's unclear orders as best he could? Even now, 2 centuries later, historians can't agree. What's your take? Let me know in the comments. Why did Ney launch these suicidal attacks? Partly because he mistakenly believed Wellington was retreating. He'd seen wounded being evacuated and thought it was a general withdrawal. Partly because Napoleon's command structure had broken down, with Ney acting independently without proper support. And partly because desperation was setting in. By 4 p.m., Prussian advance forces were appearing on Napoleon's right flank. Blücher had arrived. The Prussian arrival changed everything. Napoleon had to divert troops to hold off the Prussians, weakening his attacks on Wellington. The French were now fighting on 2 fronts, and more Prussians kept arriving. Blücher was feeding his corps into battle as they reached the field, attacking Napoleon's flank with increasing strength. Around 6 p.m., the French finally captured La Haye-Sainte, the fortified farm in Wellington's center. Its German defenders had held all day, but finally ran out of ammunition. The French now had a position close to Wellington's center. French artillery was brought up and poured devastating fire into Wellington's lines at close range. British infantry casualties mounted alarmingly. Wellington's line was wavering. The crisis of the battle had arrived. Napoleon saw his opportunity. He had one last reserve, the Imperial Guard, his elite veterans who'd never been defeated. If they could break Wellington's weakened center, the battle was won. At 7 p.m., Napoleon personally led the Guard forward to the base of the ridge, then handed command to Ney, who led them up the slope toward Wellington's center right. The Imperial Guard advanced in column, drums beating, with the confidence of troops who'd never lost. British artillery tore gaps in their ranks. They closed up and kept coming. They reached the crest of the ridge, and there, waiting for them, were British Guards, Wellington's elite infantry, formed in line, 4 ranks deep, concealed until the last moment. Wellington himself gave the order. "Now, Mallet, now's your time." The British Guards rose from where they'd been lying down and fired a devastating volley at 20 yards range into the Imperial Guard's leading ranks. French officers fell, the columns staggered, the British Guards charged with bayonets. For the first time in their history, the Imperial Guard broke. They retreated down the slope in confusion. Wellington saw the moment. He stood in his stirrups and waved his hat, the signal for general advance. The entire Anglo-Allied army surged forward. French troops, seeing the invincible Imperial Guard retreating, began to panic. Units that had fought all day and held their ground suddenly broke. What had been a battle became a rout. The Prussians, still attacking Napoleon's right flank, broke through at the village of Plancenoit. The French army was collapsing. Napoleon tried to rally his men, but it was hopeless. The old guard formed squares to cover the retreat, dying in place as the rest of the army fled. "The guard dies but does not surrender" became their legend, though many actually did surrender. Wellington and Blücher met near the inn of La Belle Alliance around 9 p.m. as the sun set on the battlefield. They shook hands. The battle was won. Napoleon's army was destroyed. The emperor fled toward Paris with the remnants of his forces. 4 days later, he abdicated again. This time, there would be no return. The casualties at Waterloo were staggering. The Anglo-Allied army suffered about 15,000 killed and wounded. The Prussians lost about 7,000. French casualties were catastrophic, about 25,000 killed and wounded, and another 8,000 captured. The battlefield was a charnel house. A contemporary described it as a scene of carnage and horror such as I had never witnessed. Wounded men and horses screamed through the night. Local villagers and soldiers spent days burying the dead in mass graves. Napoleon surrendered to the British on July the 15th and was exiled to St. Helena, a remote island in the South Atlantic where escape was impossible. He would die there in 1821, his dreams of empire finished. The Bourbon monarchy was restored in France again, this time permanently. The Congress of Vienna resumed its work of redrawing Europe's borders, creating a balance of power that would last with modifications until World War I. For Britain, Waterloo was the culmination of 23 years of nearly continuous war against revolutionary and Napoleonic France. Britain had financed, organized, and led 7 coalitions against France. British gold had funded Allied armies. The Royal Navy had blockaded French ports and protected British trade. British armies had fought in Egypt, Italy, Spain, and finally Belgium. And now, finally, Britain had won. The victory established Britain as the dominant world power. With France defeated and exhausted, no European nation could challenge British supremacy. The Royal Navy ruled the seas without rival. British trade expanded globally. But British naval supremacy wasn't won at Waterloo. It was sealed 10 years earlier at Trafalgar in 1805. When Nelson faced the combined French and Spanish fleets off the Spanish coast, he sent one of history's most famous signals. England expects that every man will do his duty. One admiral, one battle, one sacrifice, and Britain would rule the waves for a century. That's the next story we're telling on this channel. British colonies grew. The Pax Britannica, the British peace, began a century during which Britain's power and influence reached every continent. India, Africa, China, the Pacific. British merchants, missionaries, soldiers, and administrators spread across the globe, building an empire on which, it was said, the sun never set. Wellington became a national hero, later serving as Prime Minister. His reputation was immense. When asked years later what was his greatest achievement, he supposedly replied, "To have been, by God's help, the instrument of saving Europe." Waterloo was his masterpiece, a defensive battle fought against a superior enemy, holding on through 12 hours of desperate fighting until his allies arrived, then seizing the moment for a decisive counterattack. But we should remember that Waterloo was a near thing. Wellington himself acknowledged it. If the Prussians hadn't arrived, Wellington would have been forced to retreat, and Napoleon might have won. If the ground had been dry, and Napoleon had attacked earlier, the outcome might have been different. If Ney hadn't wasted French cavalry in pointless charges, those troops might have broken Wellington's line. If the Imperial Guard hadn't been defeated, the British couldn't have advanced. The battle balanced on knife edges throughout the day. From the French perspective, Waterloo was tragedy compounded by mistakes. Napoleon's health was poor. Some historians believe he was suffering from hemorrhoids or other ailments that affected his judgment. His subordinates made catastrophic errors. Ney's cavalry charges, d'Erlon's poor tactical formations, Grouchy's failure to prevent the Prussian march. The French army fought bravely, but was let down by flawed strategy and execution. Many Frenchmen believed that on a better day, with better luck, they would have won. Today, Waterloo is one of the most famous battlefields in the world. The Lion's Mound, a massive artificial hill built on the spot where the Prince of Orange was wounded, dominates the landscape. Museums, monuments, and preserved farms mark the battlefield. Every June, reenactors from across Europe gather to recreate the battle, with thousands of participants in period uniform, fighting mock battles across the same fields where their ancestors died. Waterloo ended an era, the age of Napoleon, of revolutionary wars and French hegemony was over. The age of British dominance had begun. One battle, 12 hours, and the world was transformed. That's why Waterloo matters, not just as military history, not just as the end of one man's ambition, but as the moment when the modern world order began to take shape. If this is the kind of history that fascinates you, the decisive moments, the battles that changed everything, the days when the future was determined, then you know what to do. This channel exists because these stories deserve to be told. What other battles shaped the modern world? Trafalgar, Plassey, the victories that built Britain's empire? Drop your suggestions below. Thank you for watching Britain's history. The stories that mattered, told the way they deserved.